Okay, so what I want to talk to you guys about today this is a talk that I've given, and I call it Video Games Learning and Unintended Consequences. We don't have time for me to go through the whole thing, like I said. So we'll get through part of it, and it'll still be fun. And if you're curious to see the rest of it, I actually have other recordings of this on my YouTube that you can listen to if you're curious. Okay, so my name's Ara. This is my email. If you guys would like to contact me for any reason, please feel free to. I always say this, nobody ever emails me, so I got enough time to answer questions. If you have something about, I don't know, like trying to get into the video game industry or career-related questions or something that maybe you're curious about that we didn't end up covering here, please feel free to email me. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit more about myself. So I graduated at the University of Maryland with a BS in computer science. I'm not a programmer. I actually hate programming. So I went through that course mainly because, I don't know, for some reason, well, one thing was at that time, there wasn't really, there was DigiPen, but there really wasn't a lot of schools about teaching you how to make video games. So it was the closest thing for me that mapped to video games that was available in, like, let's call a real university, right? And also, for some reason, I felt like it would be really important to have a technical background. Even though, I'm not a programmer, I actually dislike coding and doing low-level things, because what really fascinates me about video games is the interaction of the experience between the player and the game itself. And we're going to get into a lot more of that too. So I've been working as a game designer professionally since around 2004. And my favorite things about video games is there's a field called human-computer interaction. Sometimes the computer's in front, but it's better if the human's in front. And what I call just player and user psychology. And we're going to talk about some of that today too. And these are some games that I worked on. And the last project that I finished was, I was the principal designer for the official MotoGP game on mobile. So I've kind of been all over. So first, what I want to start with is explaining to you guys why learning is so important in video games. Anybody heard of James G? Or Jim G? Totally coincidentally, he's a professor at ASU, and he's known for doing a lot of work on learning and games. And so this is his quote, and I don't know, this resonates a lot with me. I don't know if it resonates with you guys. But one thing that I noticed when I was growing up and playing games, I was obsessed with games for most of my life. And I noticed that, like, the games that I would play where I actually learned the most at, and by that I mean, like, I got the best at after practicing, those were the ones that I loved playing the most. And so that was really interesting for me. So we're going to go into the depth a little bit about what that means. So I'm talking about a very specific kind of learning here. There's different senses of learning. So I'm not talking about the kind of learning that you do in school, like listening to a lecture or taking notes or whatever. Not talking about the kind of learning when you're doing pre-algebra the game, which doesn't sound like a fun game. I'm talking about, I backed up too much. The kind of, okay, maybe not. Anybody played this game? Yeah, there's a lot to learn in that game, right? Before you can, do really well. That's the kind of learning I'm talking about. Or, when you're playing Call of Duty, right? There's a lot of learning that you have to go through to get to the point where you're competitive in Call of Duty. And so the broad view of like what I'm actually talking about is all of these very different activities: basketball, chess, street fighter, rock climbing, Rock Band the game. When you play these games and when you practice them, what you're doing is you're actually, through the playing and through the practice, is you're learning competency and autonomy. And this is the kind of learning that I'm talking about here. It's like the operational knowledge of doing the activity by practicing it itself. And why is that important? Well, it's pretty much well established now that when you're feeling competent and when you have feelings of autonomy, and I'll break that down a little bit too, that's when you basically get the most amount of intrinsic motivation to do something. And what I mean by intrinsic motivation, actually I'll get into it a little bit in a minute, but this is, in my opinion, one of the most powerful, let's say, catalysts for motivation to do action in the first place. And I'll tell you what I mean, right? So by competency, what I mean and what these fellows mean in this paper that I'm quoting here, right, is that you feel competent when you're doing something when you feel like you can have an effect on the outcome. That's feelings of effectance. And part of that involves also a desire to be challenged, right? So that's competency. And autonomy is kind of like a different dimension, but it's important too. Autonomy basically means it was your idea to do the activity and you want to do it. And that's very, very important psychologically, like why you're doing something. Are you doing something because, somebody's going to give you something for it? Are you doing something because there's a rule that says you have to? Or are you doing something because, like, deep down inside, that's what you really wanted to do? These things have a profound effect on how you do whatever you're going to do afterward. So the way these guys define intrinsic motivation is it's based in the inherent satisfactions derived from action. In other words, you're doing it because you want to do it and for no other reason. It's not because you're getting paid to do it. It's not because you feel a duty to do it. It's not because you feel compelled to do it for anything outside of just deep down inside, like you want to do it. Like you guys have all felt that with certain things, right? Yeah. And isn't it interesting how, like, if there's something you feel like you have to do, but like deep down inside you don't really want to do it, like how hard is it to get going on something like that? Yeah, it's pretty hard. It's like you're just constantly fighting a wall, right? So it's interesting that there's certain qualities you have to have in a game in order to facilitate the greatest amount of intrinsic motivation. And that's good because this talk is from the perspective of a developer who basically wants to have the most number of people able to enjoy their game. So if people are intrinsically motivated to play it, and you're going to see some, I'll get into some justification for it, right? If people are intrinsically motivated to play your game, then you don't have to, it's the prospect of selling the game, right, is like you don't have to sell something that people want to do. So there's a set of qualities you have to have in the game in order for you to be intrinsically motivated to engage in it first. And these guys here, they've identified 3 of these. So one of them is that like you have to have free choice. Like you have choice, like you can do this or that in the game, right? There's rewards, but they have to be informational instead of controlling. And we'll talk a little bit about rewards that are controlling. Actually, can anybody think of an example of a reward in a game that they felt may be controlled by? It's okay. If you think of one later, you can let me know. And then the other one, right, like instructions that are non-controlling. That means like you can, instructions that are non-controlling tell you about affordances, tell you about things you can do. They don't tell you about things you have to do. And so if you have a game that has all of these qualities, then the chances of people being intrinsically motivated to engage with it are a lot higher. Now, The other side of it is that, it's really important for the game to teach you competence too. And the critical factors in there, right, these guys have identified 3 of them. One of them is that there has to be an opportunity to acquire new skills or abilities. This means that you have to be able to see that whatever game you're playing, like, you could get better at. You guys ever played a game where it's like it just feels impossible and you don't even think you get better? Yeah, you don't spend much time playing that game, do you? The second one is that the challenges have to be optimal. If it's too hard, then you just feel like you're up against the wall and you don't want to play it. And if it's too easy, it's boring. You guys ever heard of the concept of flow? That's what flow is basically talking about, But that's a whole other hour I could spend talking just about that. And the funny thing is, interestingly, like, these guys have noticed that, or at least the way that they state it, you're intrinsically motivated to play something if you feel like you can be good at it or you're getting good at it. You don't actually have to be competent. It's just the feeling or the perception there that's important. So why is all this, why is it even important to be intrinsically motivated? Why else, besides what I've mentioned? It's good for, everything else being equal, for the developer to develop their game in such a way so that it's as intrinsically motivating as possible, because then, that resistance I was talking to you guys about, right? It's not there. You don't have to fight against that. People are more interested in things that they're just, like I'm saying a tautology basically, right? But if they're intrinsically motivated, then they're also more interested, they're more engaged with it. They'll talk about it with their other friends about it. They'll tell people about it, right? You want to tell people about things you think are cool. And the other great part is that actually, and I'll show you guys this in a little bit as we go through this, you're actually improving yourself by the process of learning, which sounds pretty obvious on the face of it. And then there's all these kinds of great psychological effects that you experience when a game has all these qualities. So all of these things are associated with learning, but there's a set of practices that I've identified that are pretty endemic to what game developers do, that actually are completely unintentional and also in very significant ways they damage the learning experience. So that's what I'm going to talk about. So we'll go through these 4, and then and if I can get through 4 by the time we're at 15 after, we'll be lucky. So what I'm going to be talking about is accessibility measures. In other words, things that developers do to make their games more accessible. I'll talk about what's good and bad about that. Stat simulation systems. Can anybody guess what I mean by this? Yeah. Basically, there's a number that determines outcomes, right? And it's not your physical ability. It's a simulated stat, exactly. Like in RPGs and stuff like that. Rubber banding. Does anybody know what I could mean by that? Yeah. Exactly. I'll get into that too. I'll explain a little bit deeper. And then if we find out we have time, monetization via progression tapering. And by that, I mean, yes, but a very specific kind of microtransaction where you guys have played these mobile games? Yeah, you felt it, right? Yeah. They do that on purpose, and it's a psychological trick. Now, here's the thing about all of these. This is really important for me to clarify. I'm not here to tell you these are bad and nobody should ever do them. What I'm here to do is to get into the depth of precisely what are you trading when you do these things in a game. Because the trade-offs are very significant and they're very important, and they make a huge impact on how people experience the game. A lot of times in ways that people don't often articulate. That's why I'm really excited about talking about this stuff, because I don't feel like people really talk about these things. So we'll see if I'm right. All right, so improving accessibility. So why is this important? And why is this even an issue in games? Well, games have a really unique quality that any other type of media pretty much doesn't, at least things like books and movies and music. Has anybody played this game before? Yeah, all right, that's great. Right, so like think about like Battletoads in terms of accessibility. So in case people don't know, this is basically the hardest game ever conceived of known to man. Yeah, it's just insane. And here's the largest book ever conceived of known to man. Or it's pretty much up there, right? So when you talk about like accessibility, this is an inaccessible book, but for completely different reasons that this is an inaccessible game. So I'm pretty sure no one will disagree with this, right? You don't buy a game if you don't think you can play it, right? That's one reason why accessibility is really important. It's basically, it bounds its audience size. You know, the number of people that are able, whatever creative work you ever do in your life, the number of people that are able to grok it and digest it and understand it, that all, a lot of times is a function of how you present it. And so some presentations you can reach a lot more people with. Some presentations you reach a lot less people with. But this trade, it's not like a simple more people get to see it, less people get to see it. Like you're trading something else when you do that, and that's what I'm going to describe. So the circumstances of the reality of video game development is that we never have enough time to do the things we want to do. We never, ever, 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 ever have enough time. And so what that means is that a lot of times what will happen is you're working on a game, and let's say you have 2 months to ship, and then that's when people decide that, okay, the game's too hard, it's not accessible enough, you know? And usually these things are motivated by economic interest, but you know, you can easily apply this to any other creative work, and it doesn't have to be economically involved. So a lot of times it's late in the game where people decide, okay, our game's too hard, we need to make it easier. There's a lot of idiosyncratic reasons for that. One of which is that, you know, when you're working on your own game for like 2 years, you understand a lot of depth and subtlety about the ins and outs of just the mechanical experience of that is so subtle that, you know, you've been learning that game for 2 years, and then you put it in front of somebody who's never seen it before. And professionals make this mistake all the time. You know, you don't appreciate, it's very hard to anyway, how difficult it is for other people to try your game when you've been working on it. And that's because it's very difficult to just avoid an inherent human psychological bias that, you know, if you have experience with something, it's harder for you to imagine somebody who hasn't been through what you've been through. And so that's actually one of the reasons why like Battletoads was so hard. And also because they didn't do as much testing back then. The other thing that's interesting is that the more original your game is, right, the harder it is to figure out whether there's going to be an accessibility issue or not. And like I said, nobody has time. So unfortunately, simply because of the logistics of even just this time restraint, what ends up happening is something that I call barrier removal as an accessibility measure. So what's that? So these are from a real game. I know this is from World 8. I know that's from World 3. I know you see this first in this, but this is a hypothetical example. Right? So this is an example of barrier removal. Right? If you first made this, and I understand this is additive here, it's not subtractive, but if you first made this and decided it was too hard, what barrier removal is that you basically just put in things to eliminate what's identified as limiting player progress. And we do it all the time because it's super cheap and fast to do, and it produces obvious metric results, right? If you don't have 4 gaps that you could fall in and die accidentally, then you can't die. So they're really easy, quick answers. but there's some trade-offs. And the metrics part of it is really fascinating because I'll tell you what I mean by metrics. Metrics are things like, this is a heat map of a game. This is a heat map of where people die in some random game. So what that means is that the metric is where and how much do people fail. And it's in these hot spots, right? Metrics are really tricky. You can't just look at the numbers when you're dealing with metrics. Otherwise, you're going to miss out on a huge part of what's going on. Because they'll tell you everything, but except they won't tell you why something's happening. So like, let's just pretend, right? This is like obviously some kind of 2D game. So let's just pretend like Mario is running here. And here's a place where a whole bunch of people are dying, right? So we know that a lot of people die here. We know it's after this slope. I'm just making up these details hypothetically. The metric way to solve the accessibility problem is, oh, the metrics show us a bunch of people are dying here and they're failing here. So what do we do to solve that? Okay, well, let's not do this here and let's like make it straight instead, for example, right? That would solve the problem. But in none of this conversation, right, have we broached like why this is happening. Maybe the reason that it's happening is because you're being forced to glide down this and you don't have good control and there's an enemy here that you just didn't have enough time to react to and avoid. The metrics don't tell you anything about that. The only way you know that is you know the game. And so there's a real danger there with just relying upon metric information. We got about 15 minutes that I want to at least a portion for this. Should I tell you? I'll tell you this story really quickly. So let me tell, this is the first video game project I ever worked on professionally. I was living in Austin. This was by Acclaim Studios, Austin, in around 2004. And this is a really interesting example. So in this game, this is kind of like it's not always side-scrolling actually, but you're this character. It's kind of like an action game. So, you know, you have long-range weapons and you have short-range melee weapons, and that's basically how you negotiate the game. The thing that's really interesting about this is that, once again, through idiosyncrasies of development, right, we had to make an E3 demo because that's what you have to do when these, these conventions come around, and a lot of times that puts pressure on the game development itself because you have to stop making your game to make a demo in a lot of ways. But anyway, what ended up happening is idiosyncratically, what we had as our first level was derived from the E3 demo, and because of that, the first level, when we were almost near shipping, it became too hard. So we were thinking, okay, well, you know, in this first level, it's so hard and we don't have time to really like redesign the whole thing. So we actually very seriously considered giving you infinite player health in the first level. And there was a really interesting consequence, right? Because if you have infinite health in the first level, then guess what? Everybody passes the first level and nobody gets stuck there. More players, as a result, you know, statistically speaking, were able to reach level 2. But here's what happened. Once they got there, since they had infinite health, they had no consequences of any of their actions until they got to level 2. So what happened? If you think about the progress in a game like a funnel, right? Where it's like in the beginning of the game, the funnel is how many people can get how far, right? Well, what we did was we moved more people down the funnel, which was ostensibly a goal of accessibility, because we want to have more people that can enjoy the game for all kinds of reasons. But we didn't actually net gain anything. We just changed the shape of the funnel, and we changed where people got stuck. And the reason is because there was no consequences to what happened in the first level. We made a local improvement, right, but globally it didn't net us anything. So what this is an example of is it's barrier removal by health inflation. Basically, it's like, oh, the game's too hard, let's add health units until the game's easy enough. This is really problematic. This causes really bad side effects. Literally what you're doing is as you're increasing accessibility, you're decreasing the ability for people to learn from what you're presenting in the game. This is critical because that's the reason why people get stuck later. It's because you had a chance to teach them something and you hand-waved the whole thing, and now they got to a part that you weren't equipped. They weren't equipped. I believe that as a game designer, if you guys are going to be game designers, your responsibility, you're actually a teacher as a game designer. Your job is to teach the player the game in the best way possible. In other words, make the learning experience for the player as smooth as possible. That's how you do real accessibility. Because the problem is that if you just reduce penalties and let people walk through the expanse of the game, whatever that is, when penalties are reduced enough, they effectively become ignored. Does anybody remember the 30-man Contra code? Yeah, like you guys ever played Contra with the 30-man code? Yeah, you ever played it without it? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, like, it's funny because, you know, back in when it was new, in like 1988, I didn't feel like it was stupid hard, right? But you could say that now. Problem is, if you get used to using the 30-man code, right, you're actually not learning anything. You're just walking through the game. It's just like a gallery, effectively, because it doesn't matter, you know. Now, by degrees. All of this is by degrees. Here's one really interesting example that maybe some of you don't know about. Anybody played Ratchet and Clank here? I love that game. Okay. Stop me if you know of this. Like, I'm really curious if anybody's aware of this. Does anyone remember this scenario here? I'll explain what's happening here. This is one of those, you know how like in Ratchet and Clank they have these sequences where like you have to get from like point A to point B, right? It's kind of like an encapsulated sequence. Here you're in like a sewer or something and the water's constantly rising and you have to get to the end without drowning. You know what they do? If you fail this one and you start over, you know what happens? The water goes up more slowly next time. In fact, they do that every time you have to repeat it. They're surreptitiously changing the difficulty of your task without telling you. So it's very interesting because it's very hard to apprehend. I mean, for you to apprehend that, one of the developers actually told me. That's how I know. But what you'd have to do, right, is you'd have to go into that area there and like stop and look and watch the water rate rise and have some measure of that and notice that it's rising slower. Nobody's going to do that. So it's interesting because if you don't notice it, this is kind of like a compromise between like extremes. This is kind of interesting. And there's a couple of really interesting consequences here, right? Because this, by degrees, hurts learning, but only under certain subtle conditions, right? If you give up, then you're not going to learn from it, right? But if the challenge ends up being reduced to triviality, then you still haven't learned anything from it. So, I mean, personally, I don't really like that technique, right? But it has its uses. But here's the problem, like in summary. What you're doing when you're removing a barrier to answer the question of this is too hard and people can't get past it, what you're doing is you're removing learning from that situation. And so the real answer is you have to look at what's going on there more deeply. You know, if you don't have consequential challenges that test players' abilities, this is the part of you being the designer, you're the teacher. What do teachers do? They test, right? But you have to construct your tests in such a way that you prepare your players to be able to surmount them. In other words, if you give the player a challenge that they can't surmount, that's a failure on your part. You have failed as a designer to bring the player up to the level that they need to get to surmount the challenge that you've presented to them. And if you do barrier removal, then you're not addressing the issue with your design. You're hand-waving it. You're not You're just ignoring it, right? In other words, you should teach the activity better instead of removing the activity, right? Which is the challenging part. Okay. Anyone have any questions right now? So I think maybe I can keep going. Let's just keep going, and then, like, seriously, please just stop me, and we can, I can answer any questions as we're going. So let's talk about RPG stats a little bit. So what's happening when you're dealing with RPG stats, right? Like what I'm talking about is, you know, you have like a stat called defense, right? And then you defeat a whole bunch of enemies or you do a bunch of tasks and that brings up a metric and now your defense is magically higher than it was before. It's interesting because what oftentimes it means is that you're trading a time investment for accruing a statistical power. And there's kind of a formula for this because not all games are purely statistical and not all games are purely skill-based. There's a factor of your statistics that contribute to your outcomes, like your defense number, right? But then some games have more or less or zero skill factor. The skill factor being, right, like let's say you have a stat called defense 20, right? But there's a bullet or something or a projectile coming at you, and you have to dodge it, right? So that's where the skill factor comes in. Now here's the interesting thing, right? You increase your stat factor by repetition or grinding, but you increase your skill factor by learning. It's two dimensions of things happening at the same time. And in this formula, when this is 0, if you're in a very pure RPG type game, at least in the dimension of the mechanical modulation of your character, learning isn't possible. And indeed, right, games where you're grinding on, like you don't feel like you're learning when you're grinding a game, do you? It's very interesting because you feel like compelled to do it a lot of times, or at least I do. I don't know how you guys play games. And the other thing that's interesting is that in a pure grind game, what you're actually engaged in is a repetitive and uninterested that increases your agency. It's kind of a weird dynamic because it's like you're not actually learning anything by the grind, but there's a simulation that your avatar representation in the game has gotten better at something. Now, there are some good things about grinding, and these are the reasons why developers design games that have grinding in them, whether they're aware of it or not. One of them is that it provides a path to success for players that just can't do it. They just don't have the faculties, whatever those are. This is great because it means that a player that wouldn't otherwise be able to enjoy the depth of your game can keep going and can enjoy it some more. But it's not without cost. That's the problem. Here's some other good things, right? It gives you a promise of certainty. You know, if you're playing like Street Fighter, right? Like you don't have any certain promises in Street Fighter. The promise that grinding gives you is that you'll get a predictable reward per unit of time invested, which means that you won't feel like you wasted your time. You know, when you're playing Battletoads, you might have to play one of these levels, I don't know, 50, 60 times. And you might not be sure if you can overcome the obstacle, the challenge of it. And so it feels very, I don't know, comforting. You don't feel like you're taking a risk, you know? When you invest time in doing something, a lot of times, subconsciously or maybe even consciously, you're thinking about like, is this worth the time? The thing that's really nice about grinding is that you're getting a predictable result for just the time that you're investing. It also gives you a promise of safety because generally grinding, I mean, if it wasn't low risk and if it didn't have a low cognitive demand, in other words, you don't have to think that hard or try that hard, I mean, it wouldn't be grinding. And here's another fascinating thing, is that now a lot of times, in a lot of contexts when you have free choice, even though strictly speaking you have free choice, the way a choice is framed oftentimes strongly biases your choice. This is a psychological thing that a lot of free-to-play games use to draw you into a certain behavior versus another. This is they do this in selling, even in like microtransactions, all the time, right? Like you'll see, you guys have seen like when you're buying special currency in these games, right? Where it's like, okay, there's like you get 50, Smurf berries for this much, and you get 1,000 Smurf berries for that much, right? And if you look at it and you really want to buy some Smurf berries, you're like, well, that deal sounds horrible. Why would I get that, right? You end up choosing the one, not by coincidence, it's more money, but it's a much better deal. Well, none of that's by accident. They specifically framed the choice to you to draw you to a direction. And it works. In the aggregate anyway, it works. And the funny thing is when you have just a grindable system in your game, right? What you're doing is you're